Hey guys, so our next lecture in the Nationalism and Sectionalism series is looking at the increase of nationalism in regards to our foreign policy. So after the War of 1812, we felt again this surge of independence, we felt this surge of unity, but we were still relatively weak when it came to foreign policy. So the next presidency after James Madison is going to be that of James Monroe. James Monroe was going to be president from 1817 to 1825. He was also a member of the Democratic Republican Party, and he was also from the state of Virginia. And so one of the things that Monroe is going to do is appoint John Quincy Adams to be his Secretary of State. Now, John Quincy Adams is the son of former President John Adams. John Quincy Adams has a great knack for creating lasting treaties and bringing a sense of security to the United States, especially after the War of 1812. And so he's going to work very quickly to try to make sure that we are sound and protected when it comes to foreign policy. So the rise of nationalism in our foreign policy. One is going to be the treaty process. So kind of securing up our borders with the European countries that still had influence in the North American region. So one of the first things that Adams is going to do is to try to work out a treaty with Great Britain. So of course we know that the Treaty of Ghent had ended the War of 1812, but there wasn't really a lot settled with the Treaty of Ghent. This is where they just agreed to stop fighting. There's no exchange of boundaries, and there's not really anything that defines what that relationship with Great Britain is going to be like, particularly in our Western territory and amongst our borders of Canada and the United States. We know that Great Britain was feeling a little insecure after we had tried to invade the territory of what is present-day Canada. So John Quincy Adams is able to work out a separate treaty with Great Britain to reduce the number of fleets, both American and British fleets, along the Great Lakes, which of course shares that border between the United States and British Canada at the time. So this will be made in 1817. It also finalizes the border at the 49th parallel up into the Rocky Mountains. He's also able to reach a compromise with Great Britain in 1819 in regards to jointly occupying the Oregon Territory. So the Oregon Territory, which consists of present-day Idaho, Oregon, and Washington State, was a debated territory between Great Britain, the United States, and Russia, all trying to create claims to that land. Well, Russia had kind of started to just take away their claims to the territory, but Great Britain and the United States both felt that they had the right to occupy that territory. So John Quincy Adams was able to reach a compromise that the territory west of the Rocky Mountains could be jointly occupied by British and American citizens for the next 10 years. Now, there remained only one other outstanding area that did not involve Great Britain, and this was the dealings with Spanish Florida. So most Americans assumed that the Spanish Florida would eventually become part of the United States. And so in 1819, the Adams-Anaise Treaty is going to be created between Spain and the United States. In 1819, the Spain started to realize that they were too weak to police its New World territories. They were losing their territories in South America. This is the age of the Latin American revolutions. And they were starting to lose control in Spanish Florida. So they decided that they would secede Florida to the United States and gave up its claims to the Oregon Territory. So now we've kind of shored up what is our present day eastern border of the United States and shoring up our boundaries along the Gulf of Mexico. Then comes the Monroe Doctrine. So understanding what was going on in Europe, both Spain and Portugal had defeated Napoleon in 1815. And so the Napoleonic Wars were starting to come to an end. Well, once Spain and Portugal had defeated Napoleon, they were able to turn their interests back to Latin America. And both countries wanted to reclaim their former colonies there after the Latin American Revolution. Also, Russia had been in Alaska since 1784, but they were starting to establish trade posts along the western coast, which is part of present-day present-day California. So with both Spain and Portugal trying to move back into their colonial areas and Russia starting to move along the northwestern coastline, the United States was starting to feel a little insecure. Many Americans were interested in acquiring some of that newly claimed or newly created Mexican land, and they also wanted to take over the Spanish colony of Cuba. And we were also increasing our trade with China at the time, which seemed to be quite lucrative, that we felt threatened by the growing Russian presence on the western border. So in 1823, President Monroe was giving an address to Congress at the time, and he issued what has become known as the Monroe Doctrine, where Monroe warned all outside powers not to interfere with affairs in the Western Hemisphere, that they should not try to attempt to create new colonies or to try to overthrow those newly independent republics that were starting to grow in the Western Hemisphere, that we would consider this dangerous to our peace and our safety and may have to intervene on those nations' behalf. Now, at the same time, the United States had promised that they would not interfere in things that were going on in Europe. So it would not involve themselves in European affairs or interfere with any existing colonies in the Western Hemisphere. So it was just a statement, but it did grow in the sense of nationalism, that our unity was starting to become large enough that we felt secure enough to be able to make this proclamation to Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, that we were strong enough to be able to defend our borders. Luckily enough for us, this does not turn out to be the case, or we would not have to take action upon this, because we might have been strong in personality and ego at the time, but if we were actually challenged, we may have been defeated by those European powers.